Craig Yarborough. We're in the post-licensing class, and we're talking about contracts and closings. And in the previous sessions that we've already talked about the preparation and procedures. So you have already gone over all through the process of putting a house under contract with your clients. So when you've been showing them properties or listing properties, you're discussing with your client and educating them on the process of what it takes in order to get a house to closing, both for the buyer and the seller. And so this is the procedures now that we're going to talk about today. Is going to be once the house is under contract, getting it from contract to closing. And why is it important that you're interested in getting the closing?
Get paid.
You get paid. All the process and everything that we've talked about now is you finally got a house under contract and you're working towards getting a paycheck. So, what constitutes a closing?
Isn't that the recording of the deed?
Recordation. That constitutes your closing. Because once it's closed and recorded, then the attorney is allowed to release funds and get you a paycheck. Up until that point, we're still at a settlement stage. Okay? So, there's a process that we have to go through. And the process starts with the settlement meeting, where the client goes in and either the seller will sign the deed and sign their closing disclosure, blah, 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 and get ready so that they've done their part. And the buyer is going to come into the settlement table and meet with either an attorney or a title company, which can be a paralegal in North Carolina now. Even though if you use a title company, you got to make sure that there's an attorney on staff that can discuss the legal issues, because a paralegal is not allowed to discuss anything that's legal or as far as the understanding of a contract. Okay. The actual closing is the recordation of the deed, deeds of trust, disbursement of funds. And once you've closed, once the attorney has recorded, then we have actually transferred the title and it's complete. At that completion, then you get paid. And there's a process that we go for each one of these. Okay. Pre-closing procedures. This is what happens after you sign a contract. So you have got your clients under contract. You have represented your seller. You've negotiated a deal for the seller. And now you are moving your client into the next stage as far as preparing them for what comes next. If you're representing a seller, you're going to prepare them for as far as the home inspections, getting the deed done. You're going to be making sure you've gone over all their net costs and what it's going to cost them to close and what they're going to net at the end. This should have all been done during the contract. So you're going to be educating and keeping them on board in order to make sure this is done. Who is bearing the brunt of a lot of this is the buyer. They have a lot of expenses that are coming up at this point, and all of the, what's the word I'm looking for? All of the inspections that they're going to be doing. So now you've got to educate your buyer and continue to educate them on what happens once you go into contract. You've had these discussions. I know that while the whole time that you've been out showing properties, and they ask questions about what if, and you've had a discussion for as far as once we go into contract that you will be able to have inspections, and the home inspections, radon inspections, pest inspections, water inspections, septic inspections, all of that stuff is discussed. Now what you're doing is you've got the contract, and now we're moving forward for as far as getting it all done. What is the very first thing we do after your client has gone into contract? Get an attorney. The most important thing at this point is making sure you have an attorney on board, because they've got to have copies of the contract. And there are other things that we're going to be discussing that will be moving forward. But you need to make sure you have an attorney so that you can go ahead and tentatively schedule a closing date, which is typically the closing date that you put in your contract. And then know that date is not a set in stone date. That date in our contracts is not a time of the essence date. And you need to make sure that in any way possible that you do not ever have an attorney draft documents 4 times of the essence. You know, we're not allowed to draft those documents. All that document, we fill in the blanks in our offer to purchase. And if you need to make any of those corrections or changes because of negotiating, an attorney has to draft those addendums. Questions on that? And remember that in North Carolina, should you choose, we are allowed to use title companies to close. And a paralegal is allowed to sit in on the closing to go through documents. But at any time that there are any questions or anything arise about legal issues, they're going to make sure there's an attorney that can answer those questions. Paralegals are not allowed to do that.
It's cheaper.
Did y'all hear what Ken asked? Ken is talking about whether or not is it cheaper to use a title company versus an attorney. Typically, no. Most of the title companies here charge about the same thing that I'm aware of that an attorney does. So the only reason that some people do is a lot of people are more comfortable with them because in other states, they have used title companies to close. North Carolina has always been an attorney state. And the other thing to make sure you think about, your client chooses the attorney that they wish to use. Now, most of the time, they may ask you if you have a referral that you would recommend for them, because most people do not know an attorney. But make sure that if they do, that it's a real estate attorney. All attorneys do not do real estate transactions, and you need to make sure that you recommend an attorney that does real estate transactions, because you need to make sure they are aware of what they need to be doing to move forward to get to the settlement table. But in most cases, the title companies and the attorneys are within the same cost. And that is not a set fee. Every attorney can put whatever they choose to put in. Most of them are within a range, you know, of $100 or so for as far as what that fee is. Questions on that? Now, always keep in mind that North Carolina has always been an attorney state. There's been a few years ago now that they allowed title companies to come in and start closing with a paralegal, so long as there is an attorney available and on board that makes sure that they review documents and that they answer any legal questions. Okay. What information do you have to provide the attorney? The first thing you're going to do is send them the offer to purchase and contract, because they need to get that into their system and start the contact information for the buyer and the seller. They need the contact information because they're going to write a letter to them introducing themselves and making sure that they are aware that we're going to be doing the closing. Info on the seller's loan, social security numbers, and copies of the deed, the old deed for the seller, you're representing the seller. Now, there are a couple things that we need to discuss at this point that you're aware of. One is, as a real estate broker, we do not collect personal information from our clients. That information is collected by the attorney's office. Make sure that you have discussed this with your clients, explain to them about all the email frauds and wire frauds, so that they understand that they're going to be dealing directly with the attorney's office on these things. Because it hasn't been that long ago that we collected it all. The attorneys typically would send the buyer's agent and the seller's agent the info sheets, and we would complete those sheets and we would call our client and get their social security numbers, get their loan documents, get all of that information, write it down on a sheet, and we'd scan it back to the attorney. But now with all the email scams, we don't do that anymore. We now ask that they contact the attorney, or the attorney will contact them and get that information. The last thing you want is for your client to get hacked, and it's because you wrote their social security number down or their loan information down, and you scanned it into the email to an attorney, and everybody's getting hacked. So just be careful about what you do through email. Okay, we're going to get more into that about some other stuff too. You just need to keep in mind for as far as the legal information and what you're collecting and what you're giving out. The other thing to keep in mind is, what have we already done at this point? You choose your attorney up front, but what should you already have if you're representing the buyer?
The mortgage.
The
Or
mortgage
if it's
broker.
cash purchase.
Right, because before you ever started showing them properties or during the process of showing them properties, they have already been to a mortgage broker to get what?
Approved.
Pre-approved. Now, there are two different things that we discussed about in class, and we know is one is a pre-qualification, one is a pre-approval. Which one is better than the other?
I'd say pre-approval.
Pre-approval is the better way. Typically, under a pre-qualification, all the lender has done is they've collected, that you've told them how much money you make, and they pull your credit to verify that your credit's within reason, 640 usually above. There are loans that you can get for less than 640, but the average, the norm would be 640. So we want to make sure they're there, but that's all the verification they've done. So pre-approval is that they have typically gone in and filled out an application. And they have done, and they've presented their pay stubs, they've given them the tax records, they've given them all the information that they need, and then they pull their credit, and they're basically approved for a loan with the exception of finding a home based on the fact that there's anything else that might pop up that hasn't shown up yet. But a pre-approval definitely is going to get you closer to know that they're going to close than a pre-qualification. And there are two different letters that lenders send out. You'll see a letter that says they've been pre-approved based on certain information and then with confirmation of. And a pre-qualification is that they have furnished this information and they are approved or they are pre-qualified up to. So I like pre-approvals more so than I like pre-qualifications, but a lot of lenders use either or, so you just need to be aware of that when you're looking at the letters. Okay, but make sure that you've already chosen a lender, and now you've chosen your attorney. Now, most of our clients are going to ask us who to use. They'll come to you and ask you about lenders, they're going to ask you about attorneys, they're going to ask you about all the inspectors. It's fine for you to have somebody that you work with. I recommend that you form a relationship with 2 or 3 different attorneys, 2 or 3 inspectors, 2 or 3 lenders, so that based on whatever needs your client has, that you know that you can refer. The most important thing is you cannot get a referral fee. Please make sure that you know that in North Carolina it is illegal to take a kickback from an attorney or a lender for referring them business. If you remember, it wasn't too many years ago that we got paid for home warranties. And we used to get paid $60 on home warranty whenever we referred a client to for a home warranty. And then it was ruled that we were not insurance salesmen and that we didn't have the knowledge needed to get paid for a home warranty company unless we went through a certain process. So we don't get paid for home warranties now. And we still recommend home warranties to people because it's a good protection for them. But it's not something that we get paid on. It's the same thing with attorneys and lenders and home inspectors. Any questions? Okay. What information are you going to be providing your attorney when you go under contract? The first thing is your client, as you representing your client. If you're the buyer's agent, you're going to give them a copy of the offer to purchase. The offer to purchase has information about their loan, correct? It also has the due diligence date. It has their closing date or proposed closing date. It has all the information that they need. It has on page 12, I believe it is, it has the information for the buyer's agent, contact information, and the listing agent, and the contact information. So they have a bulk of information. And then they're going to go into their system and they're going to schedule a closing date based on the contract. That contract, again, we mentioned earlier, is not a set in stone date. There are always things that pop up. Always things that can pop up. How many of you have had a closing? How many of you have actually closed the day that you said you were?
Not all the time.
It doesn't happen very often. In some cases, if everything's smooth and it'll close right on time, maybe sometimes even a little bit earlier. But in a lot of cases, there are things that pop up and you may be a few days off, a week off. Our contracts give you what in them?
14 days.
14 days. So if you're not gonna close within that 14 days, then you need to do a change of contract. Now, on the change of contract, there's also a little box underneath it that you put a new date that says that this box is checked, that you're basically, this is the end of your contract, that you're not getting another 14-day extension after that. So make sure that you read the contract and know, because if you don't check it, and then you know that you're guaranteed 14 more days after that date, so it can drag on. Now, if you're representing a buyer, okay. But if you're representing a seller, you want to make sure that you're not going to keep dragging this out and out and out. Now, you don't want to as a buyer's agent either. You want to get them to closing because you want to go ahead and get paid on this. You want them to get moved into their new home. So you want to make sure, because sellers have time constraints too. They may be looking to move into another home. They may have already contracted to move into a retirement home, whatever, and they've got to start making payments. So they don't want to keep dragging this out. Plus, they may have got their closing date scheduled so they don't have to make another house payment. So you just want to make sure that everything runs as smooth as you can. Those dates are not put in there so that we just play around with it and we just postpone, postpone, postpone. Those dates are there so if there is an issue that has arisen, that everybody is aware of it and that we can move past that and still get to closing. They need to make sure that any cost or repairs that are done to the home, that we send them copies of the paid receipts or copies of the receipts that have to be collected at closing. Everything that your client does, buyer, seller, you want to make sure that you have copies of the repairs and the cost of. You want to make sure the attorney has those because they're going to be listed as a POC on the closing disclosure if it's been prepaid. If it hasn't, it's going to be collected at closing. It needs to know who is paying it, the buyer or the seller. But everything that is done to that property during the course of the closing, all your inspections, you need to make sure it shows up on a closing disclosure, either prepaid or to be collected. And the reason for this is it protects all of us. It protects your client and you, so that if anything arises after the fact, you can go back and look and say, hey, that was paid for, and we know the work was done, so they know who to contact if there's a problem with it. So make sure that all these things show up on there. Copies of all the inspection reports, the buyer's loan information, anything that the buyer is supposed to pay for at closing or have prepaid, such as the surveys, the appraisals, inspections, and then your settlement date. Now, how many of us today actually do surveys?
Not many.
Not many. Is that all a bad thing?
I recommend if it is a lot.
I think it's a bad thing.
I actually believe that everybody should have a survey.
Me too.
Now, I know that in some subdivisions, especially the new ones where they got everything platted out and they've got it laid out, a lot of times people say, I don't need it, because they can pretty much see the line from property to property. The other thing that a survey is good for that doesn't always show up that you need to know is easements. Because surveys are going to show where there's an easement laying against that property, whether or not there's a utility easement somewhere, and you need to make sure you note it because they need to know whether they ever decide to put up a fence. Or there's a fence that is encroached into the property. So these are reasons that you want to do surveys. Older subdivisions, I recommend that you should always do a survey. Pine Valley, all of you are familiar with Pine Valley. It is a great subdivision. It's been it's just one of those neighborhoods that people like. It's got big lots, they're older homes, but people like the lot. They like the location of Pine Valley, and they usually homes sell pretty quick in that area. But because through the years, because that neighborhood was started back in the late 50s, first home was built, I think, somewhere around 1958. But nobody really knows where the property lines are. And so if somebody in your neighbor thought, well, my property line is here, and you don't get a survey, then you find out he might be 2 feet into your property. And title insurance is not gonna protect you on that. And we haven't talked about title insurance, we're gonna get into it in a minute. But the point is that you need to make sure you recommend surveys to all of your people. Appraisals, most lenders now collect credit cards up front for appraisals. And the reason for it is because what can a buyer do during their due diligence period?
Walk away.
Walk away. And if you've already done an appraisal, and then they terminate, and the lender hasn't been paid for it, who's responsible for it? The lender. The lender ends up having to chalk up and pay for that appraisal, because they order them. And so typically, they're gonna collect credit cards up front. Sometimes they will hold the credit card until closing and not pre-charge, and they'll collect it at closing. But if it terminates, they're gonna run the card. Sometimes they go ahead and collect it up front, and then they put it on as a POC. That's all up to different lenders, and we're not getting into their process and whatever, but just be aware that these are things that you need to know, and that you educate your buyers on. And inspections. Believe it or not, this is another one that we didn't usually have to prepay at all. Home inspectors and pest inspectors used to always get paid at closing. Now they're on the bandwagon too and all getting prepaid. They're all collecting credit cards up front. Some of them may hold the credit card until after closing or till closing and put it on the closing disclosure. Some may pre-charge up front. But the reason for it is because home inspectors, who did they come after if they didn't get paid or the deal fell through? Believe it or not, in our contract, it says the buyer is responsible for these fees, but typically, who orders them?
Us.
We do. So who do they come after? They come after us. And they tell us that this one never got paid and they're looking to get paid for it. And so we need to make sure that we are educating our buyers as to these fees and making sure that they're done. If it's a pest inspection still, they're gonna collect credit card information, but I don't know of a single pest inspection company yet that is pre-billing. They go ahead and do the job, or not pre-bill, but pre-charge. Usually what they do is they're gonna do the job and hold it until closing. And then if it doesn't close, they're gonna go ahead and charge the credit card. The importance for some of this is, remember your loan. If you have a person who's doing a VA loan, whose responsibility is it to pay for pest inspection?
So-
Seller. So the seller pays for all VA pest inspections. So you don't want your buyer's credit card to get charged for that. You're gonna give them the credit card, they're gonna hold it. And then if they terminate the contract, then yes, they're gonna get billed for it because it's not a seller expense at that point. So you need to be making sure that you're walking through with your client and staying in touch with them and making sure they're aware of when the inspections are. Because a lot of clients also want to go to the home inspections. They want to be there when the home is being inspected. They're getting ready to move into this place and they want to make sure that it's what they expect. You would not believe, I have a lot of buyers who show up at home inspections and they go through the house with the inspector and then they call afterwards and say, boy, I'm glad I went over there. Even if they fix all the problems, something tells me there's going to be ongoing issues and we want to terminate. So you just got to make sure, because you want to make sure your buyer has an opportunity to go to these inspections if they choose to do so. Due diligence period. What is the most important thing to always remember about due diligence?
If you pass to lose the earnest money.
What's that?
If you pass today to lose the earnest money, so you need to do everything before the due diligence.
That's correct. During your due diligence period, you want to make sure that you get your appraisal done, you get all of your inspections done. But what is the one thing to always keep in mind that is very important during due diligence? The ending date, but what can you do during your due diligence
Walk away.
period?
Walk
Besides
away.
walk away.
Mhm.
There's
For
one
no
other thing that's
reason.
important.
For no reason. you
Renegotiate.
Mhm.
If the inspections show any issues, if the appraisal didn't come in at the value that you need, or whatever, you can still renegotiate a contract during due diligence. You need to make sure your buyer knows this, and your seller. You know, your seller can sit back there and think, well, I have negotiated a great deal on the sale of my house and it's this much money. But you need, as a listing agent, to make sure that they know that during due diligence period, that the buyer can renegotiate a contract. Especially if it did not come in at the appraised value, or if there are a lot of repairs that need to be made. So make sure it's very important that we educate all of our clients on the importance of due diligence. Now, during due diligence period, you gotta make sure you disclose all material facts. Material facts are important, and it's our responsibility, and it's our fiduciary duty to do what we can to disclose. Now, does that make us contractors? No. Are there things that may show up that we had no idea, there's no way we were gonna find? Problems. Some of the big ones right now is, we know if a house was built prior to 1978, we gotta disclose the possibility of lead. We have we have an addendum for that. So we know that lead is an issue. Asbestos. If we're living in Wilmington, North Carolina, established back in the 1700s. So what is it that we have a lot of downtown? Asbestos. We have tile on the outside of homes that are made from asbestos. We have a lot of ceiling tiles that are made from asbestos. Now, so long as you do not tear asbestos up, you're okay. It's only when you start trying to remove it and break it up that it becomes friable, that it becomes dangerous. And you gotta make sure that you go through the proper remediation to do that. You hire the right people. But the best thing to do is encapsulate asbestos and leave it alone. Just don't play with it. But these are things that come up during due diligence and home inspections. The other couple of things that are big hot topics are polybutylene piping. Polybutylene piping was used up until the mid-80s, I believe, in some of the houses. Polybutylene piping has an issue because of cracked pipes and joints, et cetera, that causes problems when people move into the home. So if you have polybutylene piping, it shows up in an inspection, you want to make sure that one is that they have verified with the seller they've had no issues, or they've had issues, what they've done to correct them. Even after a home has had polybutylene and they've replaced it, it is a material fact to be disclosed that it had polybutylene piping. The reason for it is a lot of times what they do is they replace the visible piping, but they don't replace all the piping through the walls. They don't replace it everywhere. So there's always a possibility of cracked pipes or broken pipes. So polybutylene is another issue that we need to make sure we do our due diligence and know that we've disclosed and do what we do, have to do. Oil tanks, buried oil tanks. Buried oil tanks are big. Why is that?
Because it can be leaked.
Leakage. A lot of times what people did is they used to have oil furnaces in their house. Sometimes they're pretty easy, because if you go into a house and you see an area that's cut out in the floor and they put new hardwood in, it's very evident where that flooring is. So you probably know that they at one time had a furnace. So now you need to check and see whether or not that was it above ground, was it buried? If it was buried, was it dug up, or is it still buried? And we need to do our due diligence and verify. So you walk around the house, you look for pipes stuck up out of the ground, you look for different issues. You can check downtown with utility companies and find out how far back they may go, whether or not there has been a tank there, what type. The problem with them is not the fact that they ever had them. The problem is that now a lot of those tanks are rusting and they're caving in. And not only that, but people, when they quit using them, they didn't drain them. There's still oil a lot of times in these tanks. And that oil, when they start rusting, they're saying where oil tanks were, that as far as 6 feet or further out, that the soil is contaminated. So we need to make sure that we do our part in discovering oil tanks and making sure they're removed. It used to be that we could just drain them and we could fill them up with sand and leave them. That's no longer the case. Now they have to be done
And
up
it costs a
and
lot of money to dig them though.
removed. It is not cheap. Here's the bad thing about them, is the seller's aware of them and doesn't disclose them, because we can't make a seller disclose. But that does not remove their liability if we discover it after it. Sellers are responsible for buried oil tanks even after they sell a house if it was not disclosed. So now you gotta go back into a full legal process, and who knew, what wasn't done, and making sure it's done. Now, there is a super fund that's out there through the federal government that you can apply for that helps for the removal of these. The fund is not large, it's a very small amount of money, and it gets used up fast. You go on a list, and eventually your name might pop up for as far as removing funds to help do it. But the big thing is the fact that you need to make sure you do your part in discovering the tank and getting it removed if possible, and what you need to do.
But if the, I have a question that if it is buried, but they're still using it for the house, is it okay? As a means of heat?
If buried oil tanks are still being used, typically they are still being serviced by the oil company
Yeah.
and they're maintaining the
Yeah.
oil. That is fine.
Okay, because my house I sold and we had no problem.
Right. But the oil company is maintaining those. These are the ones where you have buried oil tanks and they're no longer being
Mhm.
used and they're just buried and covered up.
Mhm.
Okay. But yeah, there are homes out there that people still have. I mean, I have a rental house that we have an oil tank, it's an oil furnace,
Mhm.
but it's above ground. We don't have a buried one.
Mhm.
So ours is above ground.
I don't know why they buried that.
They buried a lot of them back then.
Yeah.
So were some people buried, some people were above
They
ground.
just didn't
Just
make
thought it
sense.
The house that I grew up
They
in,
never thought about future, did they?
the house that I grew up in had oil furnace, but it was above ground. So it was sort of the oil company, and whenever the house was done, for as far as being buried or above ground. But if it's being serviced and it's being used, that's different. These are the ones that are just buried and left out there, and nobody knows. Because what a lot of people do is they cut those tops off.
Yeah.
It's very hard to discover sometimes whether or not there's one there.
That's bad.
Another issue that keeps popping up some here and there, we talked about the asbestos, we talked about the oil tanks, we talked about all the other things we talked about. What is the one thing that comes up almost all the time during due diligence? Septic systems. Septic systems are big because whose responsibility is it to make sure that if it's advertised as a 4-bedroom house and it's on septic, that it was perked for a 4-bedroom house? That's ours. Our responsibility to make sure. The seller, sometimes they don't know. They bought the house as a 4-bedroom house, nobody ever said anything, and they've not had any issues. But it's up to us when we sell a property to make sure the listing agent should do it and the buyer's agent should do it. It needs to be disclosed. And you call the health department, you can verify whether or not that septic system is still in use and whether or not that is perked for a 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom, 5-bedroom house. Here's something that popped up a year ago that I'd never seen before, but it has come up. New subdivisions, and the builder is using septic in the subdivisions, and they perked it for 3-bedroom houses, and then they built 4-bedroom houses. And so the septic system in a brand new house is only perked for a 3-bedroom, but they're selling a 4-bedroom house. We always have to keep in mind that the way that septic systems work is 3 bedrooms is 6 heartbeats, 4-bedroom is 8 heartbeats. It's 2 heartbeats per bedroom. That has nothing to do with the number of bathrooms, it has to do with bedrooms, because bedrooms warrant the number of people that can live in the house.
Does that count the bonus room?
Bonus, if you're counting the bonus room as a bedroom, then once you make it a fourth bedroom or
Well, do
fifth
you
bedroom,
count that as a bedroom though?
you can if it has a closet and if it's on a septic, that it was perked for a four-bedroom. Remember, there are things that we have to make sure that we go by. It can be qualified just as a bonus room, it can be an office, it can be whatever. But if you're calling it a four-bedroom house or can be used as a fourth bedroom, you better make sure that the septic system can hold it. And not only in areas that have septic, but it also pops up in other areas. There's subdivisions that have community systems. Those community systems were built based on how the contractors planned and how many bedrooms. So they may only qualify for a three-bedroom. So if you convert a garage to a fourth bedroom, you got to make sure that their system and get approval through that community system that you can do that. And you got to verify that was done. Just because you're in an area, and there's some of them here, the Cape. Okay, everybody knows the Cape. The Cape is on a private community system. It is not on city water sewer. It's on a community system. And so you got to verify and make sure that any room has been added and they're calling it a fourth bedroom or a fifth bedroom, that it qualifies for that, and they got approval for that through the community system. That's our responsibility to do during due diligence. So these are things that you just got to make sure of for as far as material facts. You need to help your buyer for as far as their loan, making sure that they know what documents that they're supposed to give to the seller, make sure that all these things are done. It's up to you to walk your people through. A lot of times you're dealing with first-time home buyers. You might be dealing with somebody who is moving from out of state, and the loan procedures could be a little bit different here than they are in another state. So it's up to us to educate and to help our buyers through this whole process. You really want to have a good working relationship with your mortgage lender. The mortgage lender, if you work with one or two of them, they're apt to be very diligent in helping you move forward and get to closing quick. If you just choose one, and they might be too busy, they may have so many other things going on that they can't work with you, it may not be the one that you want to deal with. Because you got to remember, can a lender only deal with you?
No.
Typically, no. They're out there trying to earn an income and money for their families, so they're doing loans for other people. So you need to have a relationship with the lender so that you can call and make sure that all their steps are being followed. Because one of the first things they do is after they take the application from the buyer, what are they doing with the attorney? They're ordering a 2-year chain of title. There's 3 stages of title work. And we're going to discuss all of them, but the first one is there's a preliminary, it's a 2-year chain of title. So as soon as the application is done and they collect all the information from the buyer and they send over, they're going to get a 2-year chain of title from the attorney. That 2-year chain of title, all it does is allow the attorney to pull up records and look and verify that during the past 2 years there's no liens against the property, or they've been satisfied. How long have they owned the property? Are they buying it to flip? Have they owned it for at least a year? Et cetera, et cetera. So, but there's a preliminary chain of title. That chain of title, once that's done, that goes back to the lender, and then the lender proceeds with the loan after they've gotten the preliminary chain of title. There's nothing wrong with your buyer loan shopping. Okay, they should have done this hopefully before you go under contract, so they're ready to move forward. But sometimes after their loan application is done, there could be some things that show up that maybe this lender is not the best lender for them. And that they may want to look for another lender to see if they can't beat your rate. There are different things that happen in this. The other thing is to make sure of is, who remembers Regulation X?
No.
Regulation X is, basically, it's all deals with your RESPA, for your real estate, your loans, and making sure that all the information. This is back when, you know, with the Frank Dodd, and we've changed our good faith estimates and all that stuff, and now we do the loan estimate, we have our closing disclosures, and making sure that we understand that process and making sure your buyer understands. But remember now with loan estimates, is that every time their loan changes, if something changes in it, the lender is required to give them a new loan estimate. So we need to make sure that we stay on top of all of that and make sure that they're getting it, because it can change the cost of the loan, how much money they have to bring to closing. And that can hurt a buyer. If they know they might have to bring $9,000 and all of a sudden now they got to bring $12,000, that'll affect a lot of buyers. So we need to make sure we stay on top of that and make sure that we're working with our lenders. Appraisals. Appraisals are something that's done usually outside of closing, or paid outside of closing, and they're done as soon as the application is done and they get the 2-year chain of title. In most cases, not all, it's all up to individual lenders how they do, but in a lot of cases, once that's done and it goes to underwriting, once they get that 2-year chain of title, then the underwriter will go ahead and order the appraisal. So that process can be done, because you want that to happen during your due diligence period. You do not want the appraisal to come in 24 hours after your due diligence ends and find out that it appraised for $10,000 less than the contract price. So you want to make sure that you get that done, because remember, in today's world, due diligence has nothing to do with loan approval. Your typical loan is not going to be clear to close until after your due diligence period today. So you just want to make sure that you have done everything you can to make sure it's on track. Make sure there's no questions that the lender has. Make sure there's no problems with it. Make sure that you know if there's any encroachments done by a survey, that you can get those negotiated. That stuff will show up, because when they do their title search, property insurance, you should apply for your title insurance immediately after you go under contract. Your client should start looking for insurance. Don't wait till 2 weeks before closing. There are homes out there that cannot get insurance. It has nothing to do with flood. It has to do with how many claims have been made against the property. And if you've had excessive claims, insurance companies will say no, even though these problems are fixed. If they've had that many problems, typically that means they're going to have ongoing issues. And so they do not allow them to be insured. That can hurt your client if you wait till after due diligence and discover that home can't be insured. Or, I found a company that'll insure it, but it's going to cost you $6,000 instead of $1,500. So make sure that they go ahead and start applying for insurance as soon as they can. Flood insurance, we all know the flood map process is being changed. We're still under the old maps today. They haven't been approved, but you all know the problem. Some areas are being a little eased up on. Some of them are getting worse. It's up to you to make sure that your clients are aware of the flood zone, or they're in a flood zone, or they're in a future flood zone that's coming up, because that'll affect how much insurance they have to pay. There are some areas that, remember, we're still doing federal subsidies on insurance. So if you have a flood insurance today, that policy can be transferred to the new buyer. But if they have zero flood insurance today and they have to apply, their cost is going to be much higher. So these are things that do need to be done during due diligence. Inspections. We know about wood destroying insects, pest inspection. You're going to get a pest inspection. I don't even care if you do, even on a new home. You know, because they have to treat soil, and it varies. Some builders do a 5-year, some do a 10-year treatment, soil treatment. So it's between a 5 and a 10-year deal that most soil is treated for new construction. But that doesn't mean that they can't get pests. If that neighborhood was started and they start homes and then they wait a few years before they go back, sometimes moisture can build up around property. Sometimes you can get pests you want to make sure of. Make sure that your buyer has done a physical inspection of the home during due diligence. You know, believe it or not, in our market today, a lot of buyers are writing offers on homes and going under contract on they've never seen it. You want to make sure that they do a physical inspection of that property during their due diligence period. Make sure that they're okay with that house. If there's leases, tenants in place, you want to make sure you know how long they're there for. If it's a vacation rental that maybe your people want to use for a second home. You want to make sure that you know what am I obligated for. You know, they don't want to continue leases. How long do they have to continue a lease if it's been a vacation rental?
Is it that season?
180 days. So please keep in mind that it's up to you to do all of this as your fiduciary duty to make sure where they stand. Make sure any recent repairs and building permits have been issued, that the work is done and paid for. Because the last thing that you need to have shown up is a mechanic's lien. Okay, sewage disposal, we talked about septic permits and the well and water quality. Here's the thing to keep in mind with water quality and septic systems. If you do a VA loan now, and your client is applying for a VA loan, as of January of this year, it is mandated that all well and septics have to be checked. It didn't used to be all of them. It used to be if the house was vacant for so long. Now, if it has a well and septic, VA requires an inspection of all of them. And it takes time. These are not done in 48 hours. I'm doing one right now, and we even paid for a rush. And they still taken 7 days so far. We just now got it in this morning. So you can't wait till 3 days before your due diligence ends in order to get to order these. So make sure you stay on top of these. All these things need to be ordered and done. Inspections, environmental, lead, radon. Lord only knows radon. I've lived here my life. I love Wilmington. Never have I heard of issues with radon until the last couple of years. We never thought we were going to have a radon issue here. We're flat, we're on the coast, not an issue. But believe it or not now, the coastal area, we've had several cases of reported radon poisoning and finding of radon gas. So you need to make sure, do not ever recommend to your client, oh, we live on the coast, you don't have to do that. And then find out 6 months later or a year later that there was radon in their house and somebody has cancer. So make sure that you recommend radon inspections. They're not all that expensive. There are things that need to be done to prepare the home for it. They're inexpensive. There are a couple guys here in town that do radon inspections. And so if you need some of them, I know Amerispec does it. They're one of the ones that I actually use, Amerispec. Stuart Vick. I know he does radon inspections. There are people in Raleigh that will come down and do them. They're more expensive. But you need to make sure you recommend for as far as the radon inspections, because radon is not something that you know is there. It is invisible. There's no smell to it. And basically radon is a buildup of trash particles underground and gas that comes up to the ground and it can seep in. People say, well, I live on a slab. Tough. The slab's not develop cracks. Right? And so believe me, you want to make sure it's something that needs to be done. If there is radon gas, it's an easy fix. They can put in the pole and stuff in the fan and they'll pump it up into the atmosphere. But you need to make sure that you do not just say, oh, we don't need it. Now, I will tell you, and I interject at this point, that all of us, for buyer or seller, we need to do a professional services addendum. Because on there, we can put in whose responsibility it is to pay, and we can list all these inspections, whether or not pest inspection, home inspection, the attorney and all of it, and the buyer has a right to it, and say yes or say no. But you want to make sure that you have them initial and that you have recommended that they have it and they waived it. Cover ourselves. Okay? But always recommend these inspections. You got to make sure that during your due diligence period that you have done your due diligence repair requests, whatever repairs need to be done, that you have asked for these things to be taken care of. It does not mean that the repairs are done during due diligence. You have to have them negotiated. They have until closing to get all the repairs done. But you want to make sure they're negotiated, because then you want to do an inspection and make sure they've been fixed. But all of it needs to be done during due diligence period. Make sure that during your due diligence period, and I usually try to do this before we write a contract. If there's a house in a neighborhood with covenants and restrictions, I try to get those restrictions and covenants and make sure my client has reviewed them, that they're okay with them. But make sure you at least do it during your due diligence period. There's a neighborhood here that they have restrictions on the types of flowers and trees you can plant in your yard. I mean, I'm serious. They have one that my client bought a house in there, and they had read the covenants and restrictions. And at the time, they didn't feel like that it was important to them, but I gave them the covenants and restrictions. They read them, and they bought the house. 3 months later, they called me to put it on the market and sell it, because she liked petunias because they grew during the winter. And so in the winter, she had petunias planted out front. She came home one afternoon and somebody dug them up and put them in a box on the front porch and said these were not approved flowers for the neighborhood.
I just read in the article about a flag. Did you all see that one that they put a flag of the United States on a pot, and it was not, and they made a big thing about that.
Did y'all hear what Joanna's talking about with that? It's an excellent point, but flags are big in neighborhoods. But basically what she's saying is that there was an article recently where somebody had a flagpole in the front yard and put the American flag on it, and the neighborhood is saying you can't do that. They're complaining about it. Now, in their covenants and restrictions, and I will tell you that in the covenants and restrictions, and this is another issue that has arisen in a couple other neighborhoods, is they got so carried away in banning flags that they put flags are not allowed in the neighborhood. Okay, and they banned them. But in the process, what they also did was, you know, the little flags that you have that you can put for spring, summer, winter, fall on your front porch with a little pole. By banning all flags, people can no longer have those or the little garden flags sitting out front, because they made a generic assumption, put all flags. And so now you can't have any flag in the neighborhood.
Everybody has to be alike.
That's right.
So you have to be careful and read these things. They're in the covenants and restrictions, whether or not you can have them or not. If there's any zoning issues, you know, a lot of times people might be offered having their house set up as a duplex. It happens a lot of times downtown in the historical area. You know, that a lot of the homes down there were single family, and the city allowed people to come in and set up duplexes in them because they wanted people to move in downtown. And they've given them approval to do so. Now they're no longer approving single family to be converted to duplexes. So you have to make sure that your house is zoned properly for whatever there is there. A lot of times you might have some where somebody was legal non-conforming, and now they're selling the property and now they can't do it. So you just need to make sure that you follow up and keep up with that, and make sure that any issues that arise that you have resolved. Title searches. This is where we talk about there's 3 stages of title search. There's the preliminary, which is usually your two-year title search that the attorney does. That's to get the loan moving. During this process of your loan, they're going to do the full title search. They go in and do all the research, and then they issue a letter to the title company giving their information, the fact that yes, this house is good for as far as title insurance. And then before they record, they do a final title search to make sure that nothing has popped up on there that they hadn't found the first time. So they do 3 stages. It's your 2-year, your full, and then your final. There's 3 stages of title search that the attorney's going to do. All cleared under supervision of the attorney, and it includes your mortgage and the deed of trust. Always know there's possibility of leases. And you need to follow and make sure that any leases that are out there, commercial leases, or most of what we're going to talk about are residential leases, because you need to, if you have security deposits, you need to make sure those security deposits are transferred over to the new buyer. And what can we not do? Security deposits cannot be put on a closing disclosure as such. Why? They can't be issued as a debit. They can't be issued as a debit to the seller and a credit to the buyer because it's not their money.
Right,
Mhm.
it's the renter's money.
It belongs to the tenant. And so there's typically a couple of ways that that is handled, either writing a check out of their security, security deposit over to the buyer, or they give the check to the attorney and the attorney writes a check too. There are different ways to handle that, but make sure that it's not just shows up as a debit to the
Doesn't the buyer, doesn't the buyer have to set up a separate account?
The buyer, the
For
home
that.
has to set up a trust account.
Trust account.
In order to put that money into for their tenant. So make sure that all these leases and these things are taken care of. Transfer of earnest money from the broker to the attorney. A lot of times, we no longer do that. Some do, some don't. It is your brokerage firm that you work for who makes that decision, but it can't be done more than 10 days out. 10 days before closing, you're allowed to request that check to go over to the attorney, and you'll get it over there to them. A lot of times, they will wire funds directly to the attorney, and there's a check. Most often, what we do is we just deduct it out of our commission on the closing disclosure, and then the firm will transfer that money out of their trust account to the general ledger in order to pay
It's the
us.
same thing.
But just know that you cannot take a check out of the trust account until 10 days before closing. Make sure you review both sides of the closing disclosure. At one point, up until this year, it was very difficult. Some attorneys didn't feel like that we could see the other sides. It was just a big thing
Yeah.
dealing with RESPA.
Everybody was looking the other side.
Right.
What is being done?
And now you get to see both sides, but you should verify all the dollars. Make sure that if $5,000 are given as closing costs, that they use all $5,000 of it toward closing costs. You want to protect your seller and your buyer. So you've got to make sure that you're doing your due diligence during this and your fiduciary agreement that you have with your client. Make sure that your buyer is aware that how they can bring money to closing. You know, some attorneys say all money has to be wired. Some attorneys say if it's anything over $5,000, it has to be wired. Some attorneys, if it's over $2,000. If it's under $2,000, you can bring a cashier's check. If it's under that is up to the individual attorney that you work with. But make sure that you have discussed with them and how to get that money to them. We need to make sure that we're following up with all of this and the title insurance, making sure that there are no issues with it and that they're ready to close. The biggest thing I can tell you in all of this, and we're going to take a break here in just a second after we talk about this, is we have gone from contract. We have worked with our buyers and our sellers from getting their house on the market to having a buyer find the house and getting it negotiated. Now, that does not end our responsibility. Our responsibility now is taking our seller from the contract to all the stuff that they have to be prepared for, making sure that you prepare net sheets, that you've gone over all the cost of expenses, so they know how much money they're going to walk away with. A lot of times sellers have this thing in mind that they just think, okay, I'm going to walk away with $20,000, but then when it comes down, they get a check for $11,000. It is your responsibility as a listing agent to make sure you have given them sheets that have given them, this is how much the contract is, this is how much you're going to walk away with, these are your expenses. Because they don't think about all the taxes and all the stuff that they have to pay. The commissions, all that comes out of there. And the same thing with your buyer. They need to know, and now the lender's doing their loan estimate, they're giving them a sheet. These are your expenses. This is what you're going to have to bring to closing. Now, we need to make sure that all of these things are done, and we need to make sure that all the inspections were done. We need to make sure the appraisals all came in. We need to make sure that they got home insurance. They need to make sure they got flood insurance, the surveys. All these inspections were done and satisfactory. All of this needs to be done, and this is what we do. We're the ones that are funneling this thing through and making sure that everybody gets theirs done. Now, granted, this is not your only client. but we have a fiduciary duty to each of our clients. And we need to make sure that the attorneys are doing theirs too. We need to make sure the lenders are doing theirs too. Our goal is to make sure that we follow up and make sure all this stuff is done. And then the buyer finally comes to the closing table, the settlement table, and they're gonna sit down and review all these documents. So the first thing they're gonna do is they're usually gonna look at the closing disclosure. And they're gonna go through the closing disclosure, because it tells them how much they paid for the house, how much their expenses are, the total, and then their loan amount, all the credits that they're getting back, and it gives them a dollar amount at the bottom, and then it breaks it down. Closing disclosures tell them whether or not the loan is going to be assumable or not assumable. It tells them how much their escrow accounts are, if everything, and then it tells them in a 5-year period how much they have paid, how much that they feel where they stand. The closing disclosure gives them a synopsis of their entire loan in those 4 or 5 pages. And we need to be able to explain that to our buyers before they ever get to that settlement table, so that they're aware of what to expect. Because then they go into the loan and the deed of trust and all that stuff, and we need to prepare our buyers. And we also need to prepare our sellers for the process. A lot of sellers still think they're supposed to show up at a closing. You know, in some states, sellers go to closing. They don't have to do that here. Some sellers will wait till the day of closing in order to sign the deed. So it's up to us to educate and make sure. But that's our responsibility, and we need to do so. Now, what I'm going to do real quick, and I'm going to pass y'all out, is a crossword puzzle. We're going to go take a break real quick. And when you come back, I want you to be working on this, and then we're going to take a few minutes after this, and we're going to go over that, and then we'll start the next part of the class. Thank y'all very much, and y'all have a wonderful break.